Welcome to our Data ID Services community call, brought to you by the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Scientific and Technical Information, also known as OSTI. I'm Stephanie Garrix, and joining me today from OSTI's data team are Drew Hewitt, Sarah Studwell, Neil Enzer, Lori Johnson, and Carly Robinson. Thank you everyone for tuning in today. Please keep in mind this is being recorded. If you have any questions about the recording, please let us know after today's call. Everyone is initially muted, but if you'd like to talk, you have the option to unmute yourself. Or if you feel more comfortable, please use the Zoom chat box as we are monitoring your questions and comments. For today's agenda, we have the U.S. Government ORCID Consortium presentation by our very own Carly Robinson. And then from the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, who is a member of our ORCID Consortium, we have Shelley Wren, who will present on the spallation neutron source and high flux isotope reactors ORCID integration. Then we'll lead into questions and open discussion. Next up, I will hand it off to Carly. Carly is OSTI's Assistant Director and leads OSTI's information products and services. Thank you, Carly.
Thanks, Stephanie. It's great to be able to talk to you all today about the U.S. Government ORCID Consortium. We just launched in April of this year. Some of you on the call I know are very familiar with this, but for those of you who are not, we wanted to just share with this community a little bit about the ORCID Consortium. Even though these community calls are typically focused on our data DOI services, we think there's often a lot of overlap in the various persistent identifier services, and ORCID is persistent identifiers for people, and so we figured there might be a lot of overlap and interest. So if you can go to the next slide, I'll jump right in. So to give a little bit of background to kind of where this all started, about 2.5 years ago, ORCID actually happened to notice that there are a number of DOE organizations, national laboratories, user facilities, lab libraries, other DOE offices who had begun to collect and use ORCID IDs for many purposes, tracking research outputs and awards, determining the impact of user facilities, evaluating the outreach or the outcomes of outreach efforts. And so there were a number of DOE affiliated organizations that were joining ORCID as individual members. And so ORCID reached out to myself and another colleague in Department of Energy and asked if we had ever considered having a DOE ORCID consortium to kind of bring these organizations together that were using and integrating with ORCID and becoming ORCID members. And at that point, we had not considered it. I think it was earlier days in kind of ORCID use, but there's been a lot that the DOE labs especially are doing around using ORCIDs. And so we had some internal conversations and talked to some of the existing DOE affiliated ORCID members and decided to create and offer membership in an ORCID consortium. We wanted to bring together and create a community around using ORCID IDs that also decreases membership costs, which is great, provides increased ORCID benefits and services, and also offer streamlined administrative and technical support. So we originally really focused on this being a DOE consortium, but as we started to kind of talk about getting the consortium up and running, we were talking to other federal agencies who were also interested in joining an ORCID consortium. There was actually a couple of agencies who had kind of thought about and took some initial steps to start up a consortium, but you need an initial 5 members to actually get it started, and they only had 3, and so they chose not to start that up. And so, like I said, there was a lot of interest from other agencies who wanted to join a consortium. So again, we had some internal conversations and felt like we'd be able to support not only the DOE community using ORCIDs, but also help kind of the US government-wide organizations who want to become ORCID consortium members. So so we did open it up and we kind of changed the name to the US Government ORCID Consortiums, and now other agencies have the ability to join as well. So next slide. So just to kind of introduce you to the team who is working on the U.S. Government ORCID Consortium within OSTI. It's myself. I lead OSTI's persistent identifier programs, which not only include data ID services and other DOI services, but also the ORCID Consortium. Joanna Martin works on member enrollment to the consortium. Mary Beth West is our technical support lead, and Stephanie Gertz, who you all know, does member relations for the consortium. Next slide. So what does it actually mean to be an ORCID Consortium member, particularly the U.S. Government ORCID Consortium? So when you join an ORCID Consortium, you become an ORCID member and you get access to the premium ORCID membership level. That's their highest level of membership. And you also get access to their premium API features. Some of the features that come with this premium membership include 5 API keys. So it allows organizations to integrate with multiple systems. You get on-demand access to public data files, which allows for immediate access to ORCID data. You get update notifications and webhooks, which is only available with the premium membership. And I know a lot of folks have interest in this. So this allows for API-based notifications when changes are made to ORCID records that are with IDs that are embedded in your system. So it allows for a real-time pull of updated information and notifications when an ORCID record is updated. You also get monthly analytics reports for each separate API key, and you get additional webinar-style orientation meetings and support calls with ORCID to help aid in integration. And there's kind of a lot more, but those are just some of the key things. There's actually a link at the bottom if anyone's interested for the member comparison, so you can kind of see what you get in the premium membership. One of the other big things that we see as a huge benefit to joining the U.S. Government ORCID Consortium is that you also get to be a part of a community of practice around using and integrating ORCID IDs within the U.S. federal government and within the Department of Energy. So, you know, within the Department of Energy and just the U.S. government as a whole, there's a lot of, you know, particular use cases, particular questions. And so it's wonderful to have this community that really has similar focus areas. Next slide. So there are some fees associated. So it's a little bit different than some of the other services we provide. So there is a consortium fee that is required by ORCID. So this is a fee to ORCID. And you can see the top table is the cost for DOE affiliated members. And the cost is dependent on the number of consortium members that you have. We currently have 7, and we will be moving to 9 members October 1st. And so we're in that first 5 to 9 member fees. So typically that's $6,000 that ORCID charges per member. There were a number of DOE affiliated members that were joining the consortium after kind of being individual members, and the cost for the individual membership was $5,150. We didn't want any of the DOE members to see an increase in their fees while we were just getting the consortium up. So we made that fee the exact same as if you're a basic individual member, and OSTI covers that, that $850 difference for the DOE affiliated members. For interagency members, there's still that ORCID fee. We can't do any kind of payments, of course, for other agencies, so we charge them the full $6,000 ORCID fee. There's also an additional cost for other agencies, and that's because we can't do work for them without doing some cost recovery for any of those costs. And so there's an administrative consortium fee for interagency members of $2,500 a year. That covers the administrative work that we do, you know, setting up all of the agreements, onboarding of new members, and also any of the technical support that we help provide. So if you go to the next slide. So as I mentioned, we have 7 members currently. So we have OSTI as a member, Oak Ridge National Lab, Pacific Northwest National Lab. We have 3 of the Argonne facilities. So APS, Center for Nanoscale Materials, and the Argonne Leadership Computing Facility are all members. And we currently have 1 interagency member, the USDA National Agricultural Library. As I mentioned, there are 2 more DOE labs or organizations that are joining October 1st. So we have PPPL joining, as well as the Argonne National Lab Library. So we're very excited to have those 2 new members. And there are also 3 other federal agencies that are looking to join in 2021. Next slide. So OSTI is the consortium lead organization. We are running and organizing the consortium. And so our role as the lead organization, we have kind of a number of activities that we provide. So we onboard new consortium members and do kind of onboarding presentation, getting people up to speed. We also, of course, do all of the work that it takes to get members signed on, figuring out the financial, how procurement's going to work, getting the agreement signed, things like that. And we provide all of that administrative support. We also serve as a central point of contact for members as needed. You will very likely still work directly with ORCID on any integrations whenever there are kind of specific ORCID API questions, but we can also help out with that. We just don't want to be a bottleneck in any way. So if you have existing ORCID relationships, you can work directly with ORCID, of course. We just ask that we're in the loop so that way, we can help facilitate if it's ever needed or help move things along or get your questions answered. We're also establishing and coordinating the community of practice, which we'll talk a bit more about, and also raising ORCID awareness just generally. So the consortium is not, we don't have any ORCID requirements. You have to use ORCID in systems, but we just want to kind of offer this service for those organizations that are interested in using ORCID IDs, are already doing so, and want to have ORCID integrations. Next slide. Okay, so a bit more about the community of practice. This is just getting going. It will have a very similar feel to the DOE community or the Data ID Service community calls. We have our first call in October, and Stephanie is organizing. We're very excited about it. The community calls will be open to any and all consortium members who are interested in participating. We really see this as a place to share best practices, share use cases, discuss challenges, help with ideas for how to raise ORCID awareness, share your integration ideas or your integration implementations, potentially identify collaborations, and for those who are interested, potentially offer benchmarking for consortium members. So we plan to have regular calls for all members. We are thinking about doing every other month to start, and we can increase that if it's needed. We also expect to have future webinars, trainings, and workshops for consortium members. Next slide. Okay, so I've been talking about kind of what the consortium provides, but I also just want to talk generally about what ORCID provides. So ORCID provides infrastructure both for researchers and also for ORCID members who pay the membership fees. So there's slightly different infrastructure for different user groups. So for researchers who want to get and use ORCID IDs, ORCID provides free services assigning and using ORCID IDs to help the researchers distinguish themselves, to persistently identify themselves. For ORCID members, ORCID provides member infrastructure via APIs to interact with researchers' ORCID records. These interactions happen through trusted sources and relationships that are authorized by the researcher themselves. So one of the things that I think is really key to using ORCID IDs and integrating with it is that the researcher who owns that ORCID record has to give permission for you to interact with the record. And that's really underlying kind of everything that ORCID supports. So ORCID also supports member-built integrations to make those trusted connections, to get permissions from the researchers to interact with their record. They're really a hub for synchronizing machine-readable connections between identifiers for people, organizations, and research activities. Next slide. Okay, so thought it would be helpful to talk a little bit about what's in an ORCID, a researcher's ORCID record, to also think about how you as an organization, if you're interested in becoming an ORCID member, might want to interact with a researcher's ORCID record. So this might be old news, you all might be familiar with it, but I'll just quickly go over what's in an ORCID record. So there's, very general information: names, keywords, websites, email addresses, a bio associated with the researcher. It can also include their affiliations, their educational information, their employment information. There's also a section for invited positions and distinctions, membership and services. They can also collect all of their funding information there. One of the most highly used sections of a researcher's ORCID record are their works. So this can include publications, data sets, software, reports, presentations, kind of a list of their research outputs. It can also include peer review. So if you've done peer review for different proposals or for publishers, that can be pushed into a researcher's ORCID record. And one other section that I think is particularly of interest to DOE labs and user facilities is the research resource category. So this is a place to collect information about projects the researchers associated with, research facilities that they use, specialized equipment, and also repositories. So if you go to the next slide, I just quickly wanted to show you kind of what my ORCID record looks like. So on the left-hand side, you can see kind of just the general information that I have about myself. I have a short bio. I have my employment information, my education history. If you go to the next slide, you can see I don't have anything in the invited positions or distinctions or membership and services or funding, but I do have a list of my work. So journal articles and kind of checklists, any research outputs that I'm an author on. So that's the type of information that is in an ORCID record. And this information can either be put in by the researcher themselves, or the information in a researcher's ORCID record can be supplied by the trusted organizations that researchers allow to interact. So for example, peer review and research resources, that needs to be pushed in to an ORCID record, not by the researcher, but by one of these trusted organizations. So if you go to the next slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about how, for those who are interested in kind of getting in, becoming an ORCID member, what you would do with that membership, how you would interact with a researcher's ORCID record, and what information you could push in or pull from a researcher's ORCID record. So there are a number of ways that you can interact, but there are really kind of 5 key types of integrations that are typical workflow paths. And I'll quickly talk through those. So the first is authenticating ORCID IDs of individuals using an ORCID API to ensure that the researchers are correctly identified in your system. So if you're interacting with a researcher's ORCID record, you want to make sure the researcher is who they say they are. And so you need that authentication piece. And that's really key and underlies all integrations and interactions with an ORCID record. The second is displaying ORCID IDs to signal to researchers that your system supports the use of ORCID IDs. And so that display often has a little green ID symbol that shows that you are connected with ORCID and you support that ORCID integration. The next 2 pieces, I think, are really where there's a lot of interest in interacting with the record. It's connecting or pushing or posting information to a record, or collecting, actually using what is already in the researcher's record. So for connecting, this is where you're posting or pushing information that you have in your systems to the ORCID record, creating trusted assertions and enabling researchers to easily provide validated information to other systems or profiles that they use. And that's the collection side of things. So collection is collecting information from an ORCID record to fill in information in your systems. They might be forms, they might be proposals, they could be profile systems, all of which they could authenticate into their ORCID record and say, pull all of their works, for example, into your system, or pull their education history into your system. That's the collecting side of things. And then the last is synchronizing. So this is synchronizing between research systems and ORCID records to improve reporting speed and accuracy and reduce data entry burden for researchers and administrators. So, you know, if a researcher updates their ORCID records, let's say they update their work section, and that's something that you collect in your system, you can synchronize. When they update their ORCID record, you could get updates into your system. So those are kind of the typical ways, those are the integration points you can do using the ORCID APIs in your systems. So I briefly wanted to show you an example, kind of using some of these in an actual research workflow. And Shelley will also be doing that in the next presentation that I think will be very applicable to a lot of you on the call. But I wanted to talk through the integration that we have in OSTI.gov. So OSTI.gov is the primary search tool for DOE-funded R&D results. We have an integration in OSTI.gov that uses the authenticate, the display, and the connect functions within the ORCID API. All of this is on our search side of things, but we are looking at potential integrations in our R&D search result ingest system, eLink, in the future. So right now in eLink, we do accept ORCID IDs associated with authors, but we don't have that authenticate piece. So it's not I would say, a true ORCID integration. So we're looking at doing something like that potentially in the future. So if you go to the next slide, I'm going to talk through our integration. So in OSTI.gov, we have an account page where you can either create or sign into an account. And at the bottom of the page, you'll see this green box that says the ORCID account integration. So we provide a little bit of information about what ORCID is. We provide a little bit of information about what it means to connect your ORCID account to OSTI.gov. And if you want to do that, at the very bottom, there's a button that says create or connect your ORCID ID. So if you press that button and go to the next slide, you'll get a pop-up that is the screen directly in the center. And this is asking you to authenticate yourself, to sign into your ORCID account so that we know you are who you say you are. And if you don't already have an ORCID account, it also allows you to create one at this point. So that's the authentication step. We're asking you to log into your ORCID account so that we know if we're pushing information into your record, where it should go. So one of the key things that I mentioned is getting permission to interact with a researcher's ORCID record. So if you have never logged into your ORCID account associated in the OSTI.gov integration, you'll also get this pop-up that is asking for permission from OSTI to add or update research activities in your ORCID record. So if you authorize us to do that, if you give us permission, we can do so. So if you go to the next slide, so once you have authenticated, you've connected your ORCID account to OSTI.gov, you have some additional functionality that you didn't previously have in OSTI.gov. And where you see this functionality is if you do a search in OSTI.gov, for example, I did a search for my name. I want to see the records that I have in OSTI.gov. In the search results list, you now have this new button that's on the bottom right-hand side of the screen. It says Add to ORCID Works. That button wasn't there before. And so what you can do is you can search in OSTI.gov for all of your records, and but with a click of a button, can add it to your ORCID record. So you don't have to kind of type in all of the information, all of the metadata separately. So if you click that button, Add to your ORCID record, we automatically add this to your ORCID Works. That's the connect functionality. So we're pushing information that you tell us to into your ORCID record. So if you go to the next slide, we also are doing the display ORCID ID. So you can see that this is the record that I'm an author on. You can see the little green ORCID ID symbol next to my name. That's the display functionality. We're showing that we're supporting the ORCID integration in OSTI.gov. Some other functionality that we have around the display is that not only can you search OSTI.gov for my full name, for my ORCID ID, but you can also search ORCID.org to see my ORCID record. And so if you go to the next slide, you can see if
Carly?
Okay. Yep, I will get to that in 1 second. Thank you, Drew. So you get to my ORCID record. And so that's the functionality we have in OSTI.gov. And this was my last slide. So David, thank you. I just wanted to finish that before answering. So your question is it limited to author name mapping or something? So basically, if Stephanie, do you want to go back 2 slides to that search slide? There we go. So if you do a search here, if you went down the list of records that might be associated with my name, if I put it in quotation marks, the search result list would be a lot more focused, but you're going to get some records that are associated maybe with a different Carly Robinson or with a C Robinson that is not one of my records. So you have to select which records are actually yours. We don't know that. We're not doing author disambiguation at this point in OSTI.gov. It's something that we're looking at. So you just have to select which records are yours. Does that answer your question, David?
Yeah, it did. I was just it seems a little bit like you're like, I can push any record from OSTI into my ORCID, even though I'm not necessarily an author on any of it, or maybe not even actually participated on it in any way, but I can still push it into my ORCID record, which seems weird to me.
So, this is kind of how the whole ORCID system is based. The entire record is controlled by the researcher themselves. So just like on a CV, right? I guess you could technically put a publication that is not yours on there, but I think most researchers would not choose to do that. So it's the same thing. I mean, you could add a record to your ORCID record. You could hand type it in. You could add it to OSTI.gov, but it's all up to you as the ORCID record holder. There's no way for us to kind of decide what you can or can't put into your ORCID record because you as the researcher control that.
And then the other question I kind of had was, this works for anything in OSTI, right? So software, data sets, publications, all of it, right?
Correct, yes. Anything that's in OSTI.gov or OSTI.gov includes all of the publicly available information from our other search tools as well. Yes, you could add any of those. This is just an example of a journal article record, but I could have picked a software record or a data set record.
Izzy Miller had a question. Can we pass the ORCID ID, to OSTI if the org has it? And Drew would answer that you can. We do collect the ORCID information in the API and in the web submission interface in eLink.
Correct. Yes. So for example, if a lab is collecting ORCID IDs and they, let's say in their publication management systems, they could, through the lab publication management system API link pushing into eLink, they can push the ORCID ID associated with the authors in the metadata that they send to OSTI. Or if you're adding a record kind of manually into eLink, there's also a place where you can put in the ORCID ID. So we do show those associations in OSTI.gov, but as I mentioned before, that's not kind of a true ORCID integration because we don't have that authentication piece. So if you mistype the number or misassociate the ID with the wrong Carly Robinson, we don't have any authentication step, and that's something that we're looking at in the future. Great, so I think that was my last slide. Stephanie, do you want to check just to make sure? Great, so happy to answer any other questions or save more of the discussion for our Mentimeter questions that are happening later. Okay, well, I will turn it back over to Stephanie.
Okay. Next up, I will hand it off to Shelley Wren. Shelley leads the Science and Technology Systems Group for Oak Ridge National Labs Neutron Sciences Directorate. Shelley has been with ORNL for 15 years. She started at the Data Analysis Group at the Neutron Sciences Directorate, where she worked on neutron data management and data reduction, then transitioned to the Science and Technology Systems in 2014. Thank you, Shelley, for joining us today.
Thank you, Stephanie, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Shelley Wren, Group Leader of the Science and Technology Systems at the Neutron Science Directorate, Oak Ridge National Lab. I will talk about our work on SNS and HIFER ORCID integration. Next slide, please. High flux isotope reactor, HIFER, and spallation neutron sources, SNS, are home to the world's most powerful neutron sources. Every year, we have thousands of users doing cutting-edge research work at our facilities. You can see the numbers of scientific publications, total unique users, hours of beam time, and total experiments that were done in FY19. And those numbers are also available on our public website at neutrons.ornl.gov. Next slide, please. How do we connect researchers and research organizations? ORCID is a nonprofit organization that provides non-proprietary unique identifier for researchers. Back in 2017, ORCID established working groups to formalize the interactions between researchers and research organizations. Crystal, who was representing ORNL, was very much involved in the user facilities and the publication discussions. In 2018, ORCID released 2 new sections to the ORCID records. One is the research resources. They are special resources used for research purposes, such as research facilities housing specialized equipment. The other one is service and membership. It's either a membership in an organization or donation of time and or other resources to the service of an organization. ORNL then developed a code to use ORCID APIs to auto-populate ORCID records after users authorize ORNL to publish research information under their ORCID profiles. Next, please. So here is a high-level overview of the SNS HIFER ORCID integration project's timeline and deliverables. This chart shows what we did, and I will follow up with how we did it shortly. Back in November 2018, ORCID released 2 new sections. One is the research resources, and the other one is the service and membership. A month later, ORNL posted over 500 neutron beam awards, including the year of 2017 and 18 to users' ORCID records. Then in May 2019, ORCID released new 3.0 APIs. We as ORNL posted 2019 beam time and service awards in the beginning of 2020. Next, please. So here is a screenshot of one of our 142 Science Review Committee Service Awards. So this is to acknowledge Boris Topoverk, who served on the ORNL Neutron Science Review Committee in 2019 and 2020. Just to note, the committee usually reviews proposals that will be run in the upcoming run cycle. So the year 2020 meant for SNS HIFER run cycle, the reviews were actually conducted in the fall of 2019. Next slide, please. So here's another screenshot of Thomas Halloran's ORCID profile. This is to acknowledge that he was awarded ORNL neutron beam time in 2017, 18, and 19. If you click the details button on the ORCID website, you will see the instruments he used for his research. For example, he used 2 instruments, BASIS and Sequoia, for his research proposal 18742 in 2000 at the bottom, like 2017. Next, please. ORCID website provides very good documentation on how to integrate. We implemented 7 steps from system setup to user communications, and I'll go over each one of these steps in more details in the following slide. The next slide, please. Step 1 is about system setup infrastructure work. We stored ORNL client key and a client secret in a protected configuration file. We created database tables to store ORCID user ID, access token, refresh tokens, and award type. We implemented code to make HTTP GET and POST requests to the ORCID APIs hitting relevant web service endpoints. We also created database tables to log transactions, including calls made to the ORCID APIs and the responses we received. In particular, there is a put code returned from every ORCID API that identifies every item in the ORCID database that are relevant to us. Next slide, please. This might look familiar to you. So step 2 is to prompt users to create or connect an ORCID ID to the ORNL guest portal. On the ORNL registry page, users can connect his or her ORCID profile to ORNL by clicking the Create or Connect Your ORCID ID link. Then the users will see a pop-up page to sign in or register. After user signs into ORCID, she or she will see a confirmation page. So behind the scenes, step 3 is to store the user's ORCID ID and access token during this authorization process into our database. Next slide, please. Step 4 is to clearly display the ORCID ID in user's profile. If the user no longer wants ORNL to be able to publish research information, the user can click this Remove ORCID Connection button at any time. Next, please. Step 5 is to execute our code by pulling Science Review Committee service and beam time award information from our proposal database and automatically posting awards to users' profile. We normally run this code at the end of the year, mostly because HIFR and SNS have different run cycles during the year, and we do not want to jam users' ORCID website with many activities from ORNL. We were able to summarize their work at both facilities and make one post at the end of the year. So this screenshot shows the user, this Andres. He authorized us to post his work or his service and his ORCID profile, and this is the membership and service. And here's the resources he used at our facility. Next slide, please. A successful integration takes more than just technical know-how. Communication with researchers is key to gaining support. We communicated with our user communities through different mechanisms, like bi-monthly ORNL Neutron Times newsletter, ORNL guest portal dashboard, ORNL Neutron user meeting, and also SNS HIFR user group. Next slide, please. In summary, ORNL collected authenticated ORCID IDs for researchers and their permissions for ORNL to publish their research information on their ORCID record. ONL also posted Science Review Committee Service Awards to authorized ORCID users who served on the review board starting 2014. ONL posted 2017, 18, and 19 Neutron Beamtime Awards to authorized users. Last but not the least, we wanted to thank ORCID for being part of this integration journey, for their support and certification. Thank you. I think this is my last slide.
Thank you, Shelley. Does anyone have any questions for Shelley?
I'll just maybe mention that, so as Shelley mentioned, they have been doing this work for a while at this point, and they kind of did it all before the the U.S. ORCID Consortium was around. So ORNL was one of the labs that kind of had their own membership, but has since joined the consortium. So just to kind of give a little bit of background, that even if you have an individual ORCID membership, if you're interested in the consortium, that is an option to join.
Okay, thank you, Carly. Yeah, so if you have any questions, and you don't want to unmute yourself, you also have the chat box if you'd like to ask something. All right.
It looks like we have one from Michelle. She was asking if you could speak a little bit more about your workflow for pushing updates to the research resources section for non-institutional members. That is those awarded runtime on user facilities not affiliated with the member organization. Shelley, I believe that might have been a question for you.
Oh, sorry, I thought it was for you. So the workflow for pushing update to research resources for non-institutional members. So our users don't have to be, can you explain what is non-institutional members, like ORCID members?
Sure. So this is Michelle, and I'm at Los Alamos National Laboratory. And I was just curious about how you're utilizing the updates to recognize the work being done for those that are not working with Oak Ridge, that are not employed at Oak Ridge. Currently, our implementation environment only allows LANL people to update and authenticate. So I was just curious a little bit more how you were able to get that. Okay, it looks like Terry dropped in the answer here.
I think Terry's is another question.
So Michelle, so we have 2 user facilities at Oak Ridge National Lab, and the users who use our facilities, who awarded beam time and also completed the experiment, that's how, and that's when we push the beam time award to their ORCID ID. So they don't have to be ONL employees, they just need to be a facility user and also authorize ONL to, it's a generic authorization for ONL to put research information, push research information into their ORCID profile or ORCID record. So that was the agreement between a single user and ONL. When that is committed, and we will basically just, as long as we have an ORCID ID, we will include all the users who are on the proposals that were awarded and completed for that year. And the record will show under their research resources section of the ORCID record.
Sure. So I understood that. I was speaking more towards how you go about getting the authentication with the guest users. I have a similar use case, but right now our implementation only allows for LANL affiliated people to to,
So at the ONL, we're using the ONL guest portal or user portals. We have two kind of LDAP kind of system. One is the UCANs for internal people. The other one is XCANs for users outside ONL. It can be anybody from many different countries.
okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Michelle. We have another question. We actually have a couple of questions, but Terry asked, in order to connect to a trusted organization, does the researcher have to go to each organization to do the connection? Or is there a way from within ORCID to use a pick list to connect to the trusted organization?
Yeah, I can answer that. So often these the way that an organization becomes a trusted organization is in a research workflow that the researcher is already working in. So for example, in Shelley's workflow, I think they're already going to the guest portal and they ask for permission to interact with their record there. So you don't go to the ORCID record and add it there. You give permission to these trusted organizations in the research workflow. So there is not a pick list to just kind of pick from to add or trusted organizations in the ORCID record. But you can manage those trusted organizations in the record. So if you, allowed SNS and HIFER permission to interact with your record, and you allowed OSTI to interact with your record, you can go to your ORCID record and you can remove the trusted organizations there, or as Shelley showed, you could do it from the guest portal, I think is the interaction there. So there's not a pick list. And I think I can answer Nick's question as well in that. So Nick asked, if a researcher adds a consortium member as a trusted organization, does this trusted assertion also apply to other consortium members? The answer is no. So you would need to give permission to the different organizations. It wouldn't be applicable to all of the ORCID consortium members. Did that get to your question, Terry and Nick?
I was thinking about using the DOI tool through the API. We upload data sets and I include the ORCID in those. And so I may have people from different facilities on those records as authors. And so I would need, each of those authors would have to go into OSTI, I guess, to have that connection created.
So this is where it gets a little bit complicated. So right now, if you provide ORCID IDs with authors in the metadata that you send with dataset records to OSTI when you are getting a DOI assigned, we take in that metadata, we take in that ORCID ID, we make it publicly available in our search tools, and also pass that on to DataCite, who is registering that DOI. This is where I said it's not an official ORCID integration. So we collect those ORCID IDs, but we have not, we're not doing that authentication step. You're not pushing that data set record kind of automatically pushing it into their ORCID record. The only way that they would do that is by going into a search tool, doing that authentication step, giving permission to push it into their ORCID record. So that's why it gets a little bit complicated. You can include it in the metadata. Ideally, I guess in an ideal situation when we're kind of going through the authentication steps, what you might choose to do is in your systems, you might collect that authentication and permission from each individual researcher associated with that data set. So it would probably actually happen within your system. And then we're looking at in the future potentially passing those permissions so that we just know, I shouldn't say pass the permission. Basically, we might collect information saying, hey, you know, your user facility has already done this authentication. So we know that this researcher has already kind of authenticated that they are who they say they are. Terry, I know that was a little complicated, so definitely happy to talk offline at some point as well.
Okay, great. Does everybody feel, have you got any more questions for Carly or Shelley, or questions in general about ORCID? All right, well, I think we maybe have a little bit of time here, so let's go ahead and do a Mentimeter question. If you guys want to use Mentimeter is it's a real active time where we can ask you guys questions and you give us real-time feedback. So if you could please put okay, great. Sarah's put the link into the chat window. If you could click that, that'd be great. Yes, we will be distributing these slides after today's call. Okay, and for our first question, this is a yes or no question. Are you familiar with ORCIDs, you know, before today, were you familiar with ORCID IDs? Yes or no? This just lets us know your awareness of ORCIDs for possible usage. All right, seems like a lot of people already know what ORCIDs are, ORCID IDs are. Okay, great. Someone doesn't, but hopefully today you learned a little bit more, so that's great. All right, for our next question, it is an open-ended question. Please include all your answers in a single response. Are there any other identifiers for people or researchers that you're aware of? ORCID is one of the main persistent identifiers for researchers. However, we are always interested in other identifiers that might be used. Yeah. No, not aware of any. Thank you for those. Okay, Scopus ID, Elsevier Researcher ID. Okay, thank you.
A lot of individual IDs related to a publisher or a internal system there.
Great. Thank you for those. All right, we'll go ahead and go to the next question. This is a yes or no question. Is your organization using and or collecting ORCID IDs? This lets us know who may be using ORCID IDs. You know, and obviously the more widely used ORCID IDs are, the more powerful they become. Great. Okay, and then I will put one more question in here. Thank you for those. So this is a multiple choice question. What is the state of the ORCID usage at your organization? Whether you feel it's mature, you know, ORCID IDs are commonly being used at your organization, or immature, they're being, you know, regularly used, but maybe you're only integrated into one or two of your systems. Testing, ORCID IDs are used by researchers, but really not yet integrated into your systems at all, or, you know, you haven't even begun. Great, thank you for those responses. We appreciate it. Okay, great. All right, well, this is time to wrap up. What's next? So October 27th is our next community call. and it is the last one of the year. We will resume calls back in January 2021. Please look for an invite 2 weeks before, and we will also follow up today's call with slides and Mentimeter results. Please look for that as well. Our next topic will be DOI granularity. Again, if you always have suggestions for topics or you would like to present or ask a Mentimeter question, you can contact us at doedataid@osce.gov or iad@osce.gov. As always, thank you for joining us today. It's always a pleasure, and have a wonderful day. Thank you.